Hi everyone, in this lecture video, I'm going to be talking about states of consciousness. Your text or the reading for this week goes through various states quite quickly, as this text typically does, right? That's the point, to just kind of give you a taste of things. And then what I want to do in this video is just go into a little bit more depth into some things, particularly the area of sleep, because that's an area that I think is really critical for most people, particularly busy college students like yourself. So I'm going to go into more detail about that in this video, and then one of your assignments for this week will allow you the opportunity to dive into your own sleep habits and think through what are you doing well, what might you improve, and how important is sleep in your life, and kind of what's your grade. If you were to give yourself a grade on sleep, what would it be? So let's get started. Some of this is going to be a review from what is in your textbook. So if we think about consciousness and states of consciousness, it's really about a spectrum. Imagine kind of a big almost bell-shaped curve or spectrum of consciousness. It's not a light switch that you're not conscious or you're not, right? But there are different states or different aspects of consciousness. If you look at the screen, this would be going from low, one side of the spectrum, to the other side of high consciousness. Low awareness would be death, right? That there is no conscious awareness that we know of or can test at this point. You can test kind of experimentally, right? If you want to get into magic or religion or theology, there might be a place for that. But in terms of how we measure consciousness, which is our ability to report about a understanding of ourselves and an environment, then death would be very low awareness, if no awareness whatsoever. Then it goes up to coma, sleep. So you are not unconscious when you are sleeping. You are in a low state of consciousness with a very low awareness. As we'll talk about in a moment, during sleep, there's all kinds of individual differences. Some of you sleep very deeply with very little low awareness to yourself or surroundings. Others of you might sleep very lightly and have a pretty good sense of your awareness, or at least could get there quickly. It also depends on where you're at in sleep in terms of where your level of awareness is. You can imagine if you're just starting to doze off, you have some general sense of awareness versus if you've been asleep for several hours or in a deeper sleep. Daydreaming, there is a lower level of awareness here. You may be focused or have a selective attention on something that you're thinking about, but you may then have a less awareness of yourself in this space. If you can imagine yourself listening to this lecture for a while or being in a class, sometimes you were there, it's kind of the voice is in the background, but you're really paying attention to something else. Have you ever had the experience where you're reading through a textbook and you get to the bottom of the page and you've been reading, but you have no idea what you've been reading about, right? That's a level of daydreaming or kind of this low awareness. In your reading, I want you to pay special attention to the word dissociation and how it's discussed in terms of hypnosis, in terms of drugs. Really, people can seek out experiences of dissociation purposefully for a way to escape, for a kind of deeper understanding of self, almost like a meditation or a religious experience. We can get to these low and high levels of awareness, sometimes very purposefully and intentionally, and sometimes things in our environment just bring it out, like a drug, for instance, or let's say fasting for a long period of time, or being dehydrated. Those are natural kind of boots into low level of awareness where you might hallucinate, right? You can't focus. There might be physiological ways in which we experience these. So for instance, childbirth may be one where there's a kind of dissociation, where there's a strong focus and selective attention on one thing and a lack of attention to other things. So keep this in mind, because we're going to come back to this at the end of the semester when we discuss psychological disorders and how some may spontaneously have this kinds of dissociation from certain aspects of their environment and certain aspects of themselves. And at some point and some levels with certain types of symptoms can be classified as a disorder. Moving on to the other side of the spectrum then for high awareness would be very purposeful, thoughtful, intentional decision making, mindfulness, which I'll talk about in a moment, and problem solving, right? Where you are very in tune to what's going on. You might have metacognition. You're thoughtful about the ways in which you're thinking things, right? So this would be levels of high consciousness or high awareness. Your book gives some examples. I'm going to talk about some specific examples as well. Levels of awareness on the low side. Again, sometimes people seek this out intentionally. I have a picture of someone running. I run in order to experience this kind of low level of awareness of consciousness where I don't have to focus on things. I'm often running and I don't know how long I've been running, or I'm very focused on, let's say, pain and not so focused on things in my environment or the busyness of the day or my to-do list. And so I seek this out very purposely as a form of stress release, but physiologically, but also kind of escape. Interestingly, as an endurance athlete, I've been reading a lot about this, and some of the best endurance athletes are the ones that are able to enter into this low level of awareness and kind of not pay attention to a lot of the things like pain, things like that. In fact, one of the best long distance runners is a woman who had some brain trauma and has the inability to notice the passage of time. So she's running, and for the most part, she has no idea if she's been running for 30 minutes or 3.5 hours. And so this really makes her a good endurance athlete because she doesn't notice the passage of time, which most of us would notice very intently. Trust me, there are times when I'm looking at my watch every 30 seconds, feeling like it's been a lifetime, right? So that then hinders my ability to endure and keep running. On the other hand, there are things that we can do even in the same realm in terms of exercise where we have high levels of awareness. I told you all I'm a triathlete, so I apologize for these kinds of examples, but it's my world these days. It's what I spend a lot of my time doing and studying about. Swimming is my worst part of the sport. And the thing that I've come most recently into. So when I'm swimming, it is not an escape like running is for me. I have to focus so closely on all the techniques of everything I'm doing, from breath, from where your fingers are, where your elbow is, and every single movement. And so it's a lot of work to do this. And so this sport for me is very high level of awareness. And so while I don't necessarily enjoy this on my swim, some people really pursue this, and it has been documented to be a very great form of relaxation and really, really good for the health of our body and our brain to have this kind of high level of awareness that is very tuned in. Some people call this mindfulness. When we discuss stress later on in the semester, we will talk about mindfulness specifically. You will practice mindfulness, but this is the ability to really tune in on something and notice. For us, particularly in this modern world, we tend to rush through experiences. This is why I like to talk about this consciousness with sensation and perception. And you may be very unaware of all that you are sensing throughout the day. Mindfulness allows you to focus in on sensations like breath, like temperature, like body weight and gravity and the things that are resting on your body and how your body is resting or rooted in the earth, as well as focus on thoughts and to notice them, acknowledge them, to not judge them, but then let them pass on. And this is a way that we can really slow down the mind, train the mind, and really relax and bring our body to a state of balance. And so this is really important. There's a lot of research on this now, and so we will talk about it later on in the semester. This is in your text, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but what are some of the costs and the benefits of these different states or levels of awareness? We're going to go into this low level of awareness more in a moment, but when you are not paying attention to the world around you, it's very possible that things could be influencing you without your awareness, right? And your text talks about this in terms of priming. that something you might see on a billboard could get you thinking about something and you're not really even aware that it got you thinking of that. Have you ever found yourself driving or studying and you're kind of immersed in thought, and then you suddenly start singing along with the song that's on the radio and you never really even realized that that was on, right? So we can be influenced by these factors that we're not paying attention to. The benefit and the reason why we do this and we spend much of our time in this kind of low-level awareness is that it saves a lot of mental effort. Our minds are what we call cognitive misers. They want to not expend very much energy. They want to save as much energy, talking about the brain as they. The brain wants to save as much energy as possible, and so it will select, kind of usually based on evolution, what's most important to pay attention to, and then what can be not paid attention to, right? And you will read about this when you discuss selective attention and some of the prices that we pay for having this kind of astute attention to certain things and then this ignorant attention to other things. So one thing I want to talk just briefly about in this video that you will follow up on in an assignment is implicit or unconscious associations. These are things that we are learning, associations that we are making, perhaps attitudes even that we are adopting that are in the low level of awareness area, that we have very little awareness of or no awareness of whatsoever. So the implicit versus explicit means that I'm unable to report it, right? I have no awareness of it. I have a picture here of the iceberg because we will talk more about this when we discuss Freud, but his theory was that the mind is like an iceberg, and what we are actually aware of is just the top, that there is a whole iceberg below the surface of the water. And so for Freud, there's a whole host of things that are influencing us every single moment of every single day that we know very little of. And so his theory was trying to get into that unconscious stuff to try and then treat everyday anxieties or kind of problems. We'll get into that later, and that has very little scientific evidence. But what does have a lot of scientific evidence is that our brain does work like this iceberg, that we are processing information all of the time that we are not aware of consciously, right? So there is a lot going on under the surface that we are unaware of. I always find this very unsettling, particularly for a person, and I think a species that likes to have some kind of level of control over things. To know that there's so much out of my control that may be influencing me is always disturbing. But it's very important to be aware of, because that's step one if you want to try and change any of those things that may be controlling you that you're unaware of. So for the activity or assignment for this chapter, you will be doing what's called an implicit association test, where you will take a try at testing some of these implicit or low aware or unconscious attitudes and associations that you might have. Okay, my face is kind of cutting off the sleep picture here, but what we're going to talk about next is sleep. I mentioned, I think this is incredibly important for us to dive a little bit more deeply into. We spend about a third of our life sleeping. It is the most common state of very low awareness, this kind of dissociated state that we engage in over the course of our life, and certainly daily, at least hopefully daily. So I'm going to cover just a little bit about what was already in your text, but then go into some greater detail. So as you will read, there are 3 stages of sleep and then REM. So REM is considered a 4th stage of sleep. This particular graphic says stage 3 and 4. Depending on what text you read, there are 3 and 4 stages, or some just leave out that 4th and just say 3. It's kind of a decision actually based on some medical information, where they say medically there's really no distinction between stage 3 and 4 in terms of certain sleep disorders. So we're just going to leave out the 4th stage. So you don't have to worry about that. But I just wanted to speak to the difference here between this and what's in your text. During sleep, we start at stage 1 and we move down this figure here on the screen. Stage 1 is very light sleep, and you will see in your text what the brain pattern looks like. It looks almost as if you would look when you are in a fully awake state with your eyes closed. Lots of brain activity. Your brain is moving very quickly as all those neurons are firing to communicate things from the outside world to the inside world, and so on. If I were to wake you up during this stage, you might even report that you hadn't fallen asleep. If that ever happens to you at night where you are starting to fall asleep and you notice the clock, it's very late and you think, oh, I haven't even fallen asleep. That's possible, but it's also possible that you did fall into stage 1. It just didn't feel like you were asleep yet. You are very easily wakened in this stage because it is so light. You are still somewhat aware of what's around you. Stage 2 is as you begin to fall into a deeper sleep. Your brain waves start to slow, your body temperature starts to drop, which allows you to get into a deeper sleep. Your heart rate begins to slow. All these really important things come together to allow you to begin to relax more in the body and in the brain. This is called a hypnagogic state, like hypnosis, where there is a strong dissociation. Where you are not aware of what's in your surroundings quite so much like you were in stage 1. Now, stage 3 and stage 4, if you were to continue to go into sleep, you would reach these stages of sleep. These are the deepest stages of sleep. These are really critical for us to get throughout the night or day, whenever it is that you're sleeping, because this is the stages where our brain is the least active. It has really slowed down. Our brain waves, as you will see in the text, look dramatically and distinctly different than in any other stage of sleep. They are very slow, and this is important for not only muscle and tissue repair, but we also think kind of brain rest. And so we won't get into it here. Maybe this is something I can talk about during office hours, but there are certain things that can influence your ability to get this deep restorative kind of sleep, such as certain drugs, such as certain things in your environment like light or TV or sounds or how safe you feel. Lots of things can disrupt your ability to get into this stage, and it's really critical. Now, if you were continue to be able to fall into sleep, you would go through these deep stages of sleep and into REM, which stands for rapid eye movement. When we look at the brain, there's two things going on here. One is that the brain becomes very active again, almost as if you were awake. Areas of the visual cortex are active, and yet your eyes are closed. And sometimes, if you've ever seen a person or an animal in this stage, their eyes might kind of open up a little bit, and what you see is their eyes darting around. We think that they could be following things in their dreams or just moving their eyes around a lot for whatever reason, but we think that they could be following things in their dreams because during this stage, it is one of very vivid dreams. So during this stage, as your brain is very active, you are dreaming intently and very vividly. Now, one thing I'll say here, you may not remember your dreams. There's lots of reasons why that might be. But if I were to wake you up during this stage, you would likely remember. You would know right then what it is that you're dreaming. But the problem is why some of us forget is because we go through this stage and then we wake up in another stage, and so we can't remember vividly the vivid things that we've been dreaming of. Now, I'm going to get to, in this stage, in REM, it says here on the screen that your body is paralyzed. This is something very interesting, that although our brain is very active and you have an increased heart rate, you can have an increased rate of sweating, kind of a sexual arousal, so even erections or vaginal lubrication, and yet your body is paralyzed. It's called sleep paralysis. And I'll get to why, the reason for this in a moment. I did want to show you that although it sounds like we go from stage 1, 2, 3, and then into REM, We actually cycle in and out of these stages over the course of the night or day, whenever it is that you're sleeping. Imagine a 7-hour period of sleep, and you can see that we start with being awake. We go down to the N here stands for non-REM. So stage 1, 2, 3, we cycle up into REM, and then we cycle down and up into REM, and you can see that over the course of the evening, some of these deep sleep stages actually go away, and you spend much of your time kind of in this heightened state of sleep. So this is important to think about in all different kinds of ways. Some is to be aware that this deep sleep happens usually the first hours. So we need to be mindful of trying to give ourselves a situation that would encourage and allow for that deep sleep. This is also important to think about in terms of when you wake up. If you've ever had a nap and you wake up feeling more groggy and tired than you were when you fell asleep, it's probably because you got down into one of these deep stages of sleep and then woke up. If you wake up in one of these lighter stages, like REM or stage 1 or 2, you won't feel so groggy. That's why they say like a 20-minute nap is the best, because you don't yet go into that deep sleep. There are lots of individual differences though. If you have a smartphone or some kind of smart device, a Fitbit or a smartwatch, there's some really cool apps that can actually measure and track your sleep stages. And so now that we're learning about it, you can track that and see where you're at. I don't know how accurate some of them are, but some of them can be very accurate, particularly if they're worn. What they're measuring is heart rate, sometimes even body temperature, but also movement. So something really interesting about sleep, and particularly these deep stages of sleep, is that, as I mentioned, they're for rest, right? For tissue repair of body and brain. Now, some animals, and humans as well, which I'll get to in a moment, do some really interesting things when they're sleeping. Dolphins and ducks, for instance, can actually shut off or have a whole hemisphere sleep while the other one is awake. This is really important for animals so that they can be more aware of their environment. So for instance, animals that have to be constantly swimming, for instance, right? It would be not very adaptive if their whole brain went to sleep because they could float, or these animals have to breathe, right? So they have to have an active brain. So what they do is they'll shut down a hemisphere. Ducks, interestingly, I think you can kind of see here on the screen, they will kind of put one hemisphere to sleep, and then you will see them. Now go look for ducks in a row. If there's a whole bunch of ducks, let's say on a log, the one on this side will have its left eye open, which means, think back to last week's information that we're contralateral control. So if their left eye is open, that means their right hemisphere is active and their left hemisphere is getting rest. The duck on the other side of the log will have its right eye open, which means its left hemisphere is active and its right hemisphere is getting some rest. So interesting. So ducks and dolphins have this kind of hemispheric shut-off ability while sleeping. We don't have that kind of ability where we can exclusively shut certain hemispheres off, but our brain does have some very interesting functions based on structure when we are sleeping. And mostly during these deep sleep times or stages, what is resting is our frontal lobe. Because think about, that's the part that's very active during the day with all these kinds of higher order things that us humans have to do. So during sleep, the activity in the frontal lobe becomes very minimal, while other parts in our brain may be active. This explains some very strange sleep behaviors that many of you probably have some kind of personal experience with, that you have either done it yourself or seen others do it, like sleepwalking, sleep talking, and then the category of these kinds of what we call parasomnias or sleep disorders of stage 3 abounds. There is sleep eating, there is sleep sex, all kinds of things that people can engage in while they are sleeping. You wonder, how are you able to talk? How are you able to walk while sleeping? Well, because those parts of the brain, which are very basic, are still awake. They've slowed down, but they're still awake. But why do you not make much sense often while you're talking? Or, why might you go to the refrigerator and engorge in thousands of calories? Well, because the frontal lobe is much less active, and so you don't have the kind of impulse control. Sleep eaters, just as an aside, can engage in very dangerous eating behaviors where they can put raw eggs in the eggshell in a blender, or put paper in the oven, or eat things that are inedible like sponges. So all because that kind of part of the frontal lobe that would help them make good decisions is asleep, right? They are, as one has said, a researcher in this area has said, they are like zombies, speaking of zombies, right, with a mouth to feed. So I'm going to put in the link below, or in the box below, a link to a very interesting video on sleep eating where you can meet a sleep eater, get some of the brain science behind it. It is something that is a pretty common phenomenon, mostly in the United States, but in others as well, other countries as well, and particularly among women. It is also a side effect of some sleep aids. So be sure if you take any sleep aids, you read the side effects very closely. Because what some of these sleep aids do is they help you to very quickly get into deep sleep, and so you may be more apt to engage in some of these parasomnia behaviors. Now, there's also some parasomnias or sleep disorders of the REM stage of sleep. These are very interesting because here the brain is very active. One of the most common parasomnias of REM is to not have that kind of sleep paralysis or have an extended sleep paralysis where you wake up and cannot move, or you are deep in sleep. Well, I shouldn't say deep, but you are in sleep in REM and your body is not paralyzed. So again, if you watch that video in the link below, you will see some examples of people with this type of parasomnia. Think for just a moment before I wrap up this video. If you can remember your dreams, would you say that your dreams mostly have a positive or a negative content to them? We all tend to have good dreams, but if we were to rate them, more often than not, we are dreaming of things that are kind of negative in nature, scary, anxiety-provoking, stressful, right? Now imagine if you could act out those dreams. And that's what you see with some of these folks that have this particular disorder. You will see people up on their bed making stabbing motions, trying to ward things off. And so this can be a very dangerous disorder, okay, because the brain is so active. It's as if you are awake, right? But you are unaware of your surroundings and how you are engaging in them. So I know that's just a kind of, again, to speak of tip of the iceberg in terms of sleep. I love talking about the states of consciousness. So relevant, so interesting, but I'm going to wrap it up there. If you're looking for more, come visit me during live office hours and we'll talk about it. Shoot me an email, meet with me one-on-one in office hours. I would love to hear what your questions are and talk with you. But what I will say now and how I will leave it is sleep well, everyone, and I'll see you soon.